What's up, Wizards Dev? SBMTG, we like it, magic, all that stuff, and whew, boy, do we have a lot of Throne of Eldraine spoilers to go through today. I just woke up from a midday nap. I stayed up all last night, recorded 2 videos, got my spoiler video out at like 10:30 this morning, went to bed from like 12 to 5, woke up, and suddenly there's like 2,000 new spoilers for this set. You can play all the Brawl decks on Arena right now, and we saw all the cards from those. Mostly where this blow up came from, and we got to see a bunch of sets that we're about to go to. Turns out we're going back to Theros, we're going back to Zendikar. There's going to be a whole Teferi set. I don't know how excited anybody is about that, but whatever. Turns out what we're here to do today is just talk about these like 40 cards that got spoiled almost all at one time today. There's a lot to sift through, but I'm just going to try to do like a basic analysis of each and every one of these cards and move through. But in the interest of speed, I'm just going to go total voiceover today and just try to, consolidate as much rendering and editing time as I possibly can so that I can get this thing out, because there's a bunch of cards to talk about. So that said, we got to go ahead and jump into it and talk about a couple of cards I didn't get to yesterday because we didn't quite know how the adventure mechanic worked, but we've got it sewn up today, so I can go ahead and talk about Flaxen Intruder. Let's read over this thing real quick. So it's just 1 green mana for a 1/2 human berserker, and when it deals combat damage to a player, you can sacrifice it, and if you do, destroy target artifact or enchantment, which is really cute flavor in a set where food is an artifact. You see what they did there? But anyway, this also, you may have noticed, has a sorcery stapled to it where you can pay 7 mana to create 3 2/2 green bear creature tokens. And again, we weren't quite sure how this worked last night, but now we know exactly what adventure is. You can cast this out of your hand as either the creature half for 1 mana, or again, out of your hand, you can cast the spell half for 7 mana to create the 3 bears. If you cast the spell half, then you exile the spell itself, Flaxen Intruder. You can cast that later for just the 1 green mana and get the creature on the battlefield. And there's a lot of cards that we got to see today with this ability, and I just want to say up front, I really like this mechanic a lot. I think that it increases the versatility on a lot of cards by a huge amount. You can either play a creature or you can play a spell. If you play the spell, you don't lose the creature. It's like having a split card that you can play one half of and then bank the other half to play later, which is really good. So I love this mechanic, and I'm not like a huge fan of this card. It's an interesting 1-drop, and I love the flavor on it. I mean, they made Goldilocks like that much is self-evident, so I like what they did with it, and I love the design of it, but I'm not sure that it's going to see all the play in the world. I don't like stuff that has to deal combat damage to actually, create an effect, and sometimes those can be okay. In a Thief of Sanity, we just saw Rankle yesterday, and that has to get through for combat damage, but it's probably well worth it. A card like this, I'm just not too sure of, especially when the spell half costs so much, but a much better example to me of the adventure mechanic is Love-Struck Beasts. Of course, the flavor on this is incredible, but it's just 3 mana, 2 and a green for a 5/5 Beast Noble, and it can't attack, it just can't attack unless you control a 1/1 creature, but this adventure mode on this is called Heart's Desire. It's just 1 green mana for a sorcery. You create a 1/1 white human creature token, so you create a Belle. She's chilling in the background over there. Art is just phenomenal on this card, but the card itself is phenomenal as well. I mean, it's a 3 mana 5/5 that's really easy to cast. It's not like Steel Leaf Champion, where you have to be in mono green to get your 5 power guy for 3 mana. No, not at all. And we just saw Gilded Goose yesterday, so we have a way of casting this on turn 2 if we absolutely have to. That said, you still have to get a 1/1 before you can actually attack with it, but the creature that Heart's Desire creates isn't the only 1/1 in the format, obviously. We've got the Afterlife mechanic, plus a bunch of just 1 mana 1/1 creatures and such. It's really not going to be too hard, especially in decks like Selesnya, for instance, or even Green-Black, to really get this card to pop off without even having to cast the Heart's Desire part of it. But keep in mind, if you do cast Heart's Desire on turn 1, then on turn 3, you can get Love-Struck Beast out of exile and start attacking with it by turn 4. So this card looks really insane in terms of stats and flavor for that matter, but just in terms of competitive playability, I really like the look of this card. But we got to see a bunch of other stuff with the adventure mechanic spoiled on it today, mostly as a factor of seeing all the Brawl decks on Arena. And as far as the Brawl decks, I'm going to start with the Knight deck, just because that's what was spoiled sort of in chronological order here. So let me start with Order of Midnight, which is actually, again, really cool. I love the adventure mechanic on this. It's just 2 mana, 1 and a black for a 2/2 human knight with flying, but it can't block, which is actually not a bad creature in and of itself. A 2/2 flying for 2 is fine, especially in this color, but Alter Fate is the adventure. It's a sorcery, 1 and a black. Return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand, and then you have the reminder text to actually shore up what the adventure mechanic is. You exile this card after you cast the sorcery half of it, and then you can cast the creature later from exile. So the way this ends up working in this format, in Limited especially, is we've got a bunch of these creatures with the adventure mechanic on them. So if you cast a creature and it ends up dying, well, then you just get it back from your graveyard, put it in your hand with this, and then you get another crack at casting the spell half of it. I think that's going to be really, really important. Just keep in mind that these return things from your graveyard to your hand spells are going to be much better, especially in the Limited environment, than they usually are, because they effectively give you 2 spells back at one time. So I really like Order of Midnight, and I'm not sure that it makes a splash anywhere outside of Limited, but in Limited, it's a very good card. You want flyers, evasive bodies. It's a 2/2 for 2 anyway, so it's not bad stats in and of itself. And the spell half is very, very nice for sort of getting card advantage or selection out of your graveyard later. So love it in Limited, but it's got enough utility on it to at least be considered in very specific standard decks. As far as other stuff we got to see with Adventure today that's also in these Knight decks, there's Smitten Sword Master, which is a great name for a card. It's just 1 and a black for a 2/1 human knight with lifelink. Not terrible stats, but the sorcery half of this is Curry Favor. It's a sorcery with Adventure, and you can gain X life, and each opponent loses X life, where X is the number of knights you control. Not too bad for just 1 black mana. The problem is that there's really no way to affect the board on the sorcery half of this, which I don't necessarily like, but it's one of the few ways that the Knight deck in Brawl has of getting any kind of late game advantage or reach, I should say. Reach is the better term there. That deck has kind of a tough time finishing from what we understand so far, and this is actually a really nice way, especially in conjunction with that last card that we just saw, of being able to just deal a bunch of damage all at one time to your opponents. So I think this is actually really neat. I wish that we had it in Knight decks, in the last format. It kind of sucks that we're getting a bunch of Knights right as we lose a bunch of Knights. Sketchy, but I still think that the Knights we've seen so far have been pretty cool, and this is one of them. If you're building Knight Tribal, this is definitely for you. And if you're building Knights in Commander, this is also a card you want to play the one of. So I like Smitten Sword Master, but again, I'm not totally sure that it ends up seeing all the standard play, but 2 mana for a 2-power lifelink could definitely be worse. Let's put it that way. As far as the next one, we got Foulmire Knight right here. This is just 1 black mana for a 1/1 zombie knight with Death Touch, but it also has Adventure, but this Adventure is an instant. We haven't seen too much of that. It's called Profane Insight. 2 and a black. You draw a card and you lose a life. So actually, if you play this for 3 mana at the end of your opponent's turn, draw the card, lose the life, and then on your turn, you immediately just play the 1/1 Death Touch to block stuff. Actually, doesn't seem so bad. Again, I like this in Limited mostly. It is a Knight, so it's got a proper creature type, but in Limited, I don't mind 1/1 Death Touches. I think that's pretty good, and if you draw it in the late game, it's not a bad top deck because you're at least going to draw a card off of it and still get a 1/1 Death Touch. It's not like you lose the ability to play the creatures. So, again, I really like the implications of this in Limited, but let's move on to something really exciting in the Knight category. This is Sire Conrad the Grim. That's a cool name. It's 5 mana, 3 and 2 black for a 5/4 legendary human knight, and check out this text box. Whenever another creature dies, or a creature card is put into a graveyard from anywhere other than the battlefield, or a creature leaves your graveyard, Sire Conrad the Grim deals 1 damage to each opponent. So it's like a super blood artist. You can also pay 1 and a black to have each player put the top card of their library into their graveyard. Now, each player seems like a downside, but if you're trying to do reanimation, and note that this works with reanimation whenever a creature leaves your graveyard, and this could be good with that, but it also works for mill. If a creature goes to the graveyard from anywhere other than the battlefield, i.e. being milled from the top of a library, then you'll still get the damage out of it. So this seems really, really nice for all kinds of different decks. It's a Blood Artist for Aristocrats decks that already need a Blood Artist anyway. It's a Blood Artist for mill decks. It's a Blood Artist for reanimation decks. Everyone gets a Cruel Celebrant in this set, but it does cost 5 mana. That is... I hate to be a downer here, a negative Nancy, Debbie Downer, but it's 5 mana, and it only has the 4 toughness, and it doesn't really do much the turn that it enters the battlefield in most cases. So I'm not as high on it as I want to be. I really, really want to like this card an awful lot, but I think there are definitely things that are prohibitive in Standard at least to playing this card. Like Lava Coil is probably going to be a really popular piece of removal in the upcoming format, and I just think that a 5-mana creature that dies to Lava Coil is really, you're kind of asking for it. So I'm not sure as far as standard playability, but if they're looking for Brawl playability or Commander playability, I think they hit a pretty nice mark with this. But I'm going to try to jam it in every mill deck that we build in the upcoming standard here and see what happens. But up next we got Tournament Grounds. This is a land, of course. You tap it for a colorless, or you can tap it to add any of the Mardu colors to your mana pool, but you can only spend that mana to cast a Knight or an equipment spell. So this goes in the Knight Brawl deck. You get 1 copy of it, and I was really hoping that like every deck would get one of these, but I'm not sure that's actually the case. And it is definitely cool, and it's going to be great in Commander, and of course, again, Brawl as mentioned, but I'm not really sure that it sees all the tournament play unless, of course, Knights is a real deck. And right now it's not looking like the realest of real decks. I know you don't want to hear that, but that's just how it is. That said, though, if you're playing Knights in Commander or Brawl, this is all for you. And it's probably going to remain an important card for that reason, if nothing else. You know, you're playing Equipments or Knights in Commander, you need the card. So probably scoop up a couple of copies. It's going to be worth something. But let's move on to Embereth's Shieldbreaker, which has some of the coolest art of the entire day. Just pause to appreciate that, because the card isn't really much to write home about. It's just a 2-mana 2/1 human knight, but it's got an adventure on it. You can battle display for just 1 red mana. It's a sorcery, destroy target artifact. So you bust up an artifact, and then for just a total of 3 mana, you can do it on the same turn. You get a 2/1 creature. Not great, but probably going to be a great like sideboard option for limited decks, all right, your pre-release, so keep that in mind. So let's move on to Fireborn Nightray, or 4-mana hybrid. I love hybrid mana costs. I cannot get over how awesome it is that we have these again. And we see them every now and again, Footlight Fiend and a few other cards in the last few sets, but I'm just always hyped about hybrid costs. But anyway, it's 4 Boros colors, either red and white for each cost. It's a 2/3 human knight with double strike, and you can pay its casting cost again to activate it, and it gets +1/+1 till end of turn. And obviously these fire breathing or pump abilities are going to be way better on double strike creatures, and if you enchant this somehow, it's going to be awesome. But I still don't know how much standard playability I see on this card. That said, in limited it looks like a very, very nice piece, especially if you get a couple of sweet R's you can throw on it. But let's move on to Circle of Loyalty. 6 mana, 4 and 2 white, but there's a catch. It's a legendary artifact, and it costs 1 less to cast for each knight that you control. Creatures you control get +1/+1, and whenever you cast a legendary spell, you create a 2/2 white knight creature token with vigilance. It's really a 3/3, because creatures you control get +1/+1. I do really like this, and I think it's a great way for the Brawl Knights deck to get some form of reach in the late game, which it really needs to be able to close games out from what we can tell about it so far. And I love it for that purpose, but I don't necessarily like it in Standard. I don't like that it's legendary. I was all ready to say this snowballs into multiple copies of itself really well, because each copy is going to cost less and less, but obviously it's legendary. But that said, it does have a little bit of mitigation baked into the card, because you can cast another copy of it on top of one that you already have, and yeah, one's got to go to the graveyard, but you still cast a legendary spell, so you'll trigger this ability that gives you a 2/2 knight. So it's actually got a baked in way to mitigate the fact that it's legendary if you draw multiple copies of it. I do really like that. But that said, if you want to proc it any more than that, you have to cast more legendary spells, and that's not always a given. So as far as anthem effects go, I'm not a huge fan, but I do like anthem effects that also have a baked-in way of creating the creature that's relevant to the anthem. So I think this has some really, really cool stuff on it, but in the end, I'm not sure that if this is like the big finisher for the Knight deck, that the Knight deck has the chops to make it in Standard. But we got to see a lot more for the Knight deck than just the cards we've seen so far. We also got to see Wintermoor Commander, which is 2 mana, a black and a white, for a 2-star human knight with Death Touch. And its toughness, that star, is equal to the number of knights that you control. So it's always at least 1. And whenever Commander attacks, another target knight you control gains indestructible until end of turn. So it's got a soul bondy kind of ability. And that's actually really, really, really good. I like that a lot. I'm not a huge fan of the stats on this, although once you do get 2 other knights, 3 other knights, and the toughness does start getting really good for the investment. But again, I'm just not sure that in the aggressive knights deck that wants to exist in standard, that this is exactly where you want to be. If its power were equal to the number of knights you control, that'd be a whole different thing. So I like that, and indestructibility is obviously a very good ability, but I mean, while this is on the stack, they can just kill the guy if they're going to kill the guy. So there's always that to think about, too. I'm just not sure that this is quite as good as it looks. But there was at least one really nice-looking card for the Knights deck today, and that was Inspiring Veteran. This is 2 mana, just a red and white for a 2/2. Other knights you control get +1/+1. So we get one of these, like, Ixalan 2/2 for 2 mana, these Bear Anthem effects in this set, and that's really, really nice. For the Knights deck. But I mean, that kind of goes without saying. We also got another 1 mana 2 power creature for the Knights deck today, and it really needed that to replace a couple of things too. We got Venerable Knight, just 1 mana for a 2/1 human knight, and when it dies, you put a +1/+1 counter on target knight you control. So that's actually really good Savannah Lions right there, man. Not only do you get the normal upfront stats that you really want out of an aggressive 1-drop, but when it dies, it also sort of replaces some of its power, and that is really, really nice in an aggressive deck. I like this an awful lot. If your opponent tries to sweep you with like Cry the Carnarium or Deafening Clarion and you have 1 creature that survives, Venerable Knight's power goes on to that creature, and that can really make a huge difference. So big fan of Venerable Knight. The Knight deck obviously needs other 1-drops besides just like Order of the Ebon Hand or whatever it is. The Knight of the Ebon Legion, I think it's called. And this is a great addition to replace stuff like Skymarcher Aspirant, other things that were rotating in this sort of, Savannah Lions slot, we'll call it. Let's move on to some other sort of non-Knights deck stuff, finally. Let's look at Bake into a Pie real quick. This is just hilarious. 4 mana, 2 and 2 black for an instant. Destroy a creature, create a food token. This is actually better than it looks, I think. It doesn't replace Vraska's Contempt or anything, but it still kind of destroys a creature and gains 3 life instead of 2. That said, you lose the ability to gain the life immediately. You have to pay life or mana for the life, and you can't destroy planeswalkers. So again, nowhere near as good as Contempt, but it's going to be incredible in limited, and I can actually see a copy or maybe even 2 sneaking into a standard control deck here and there. But there's also Piper of the Swarm. This card's just really, really cool in terms of flavor and function for what it's worth. It's 2 mana, 1 and a black for a 1/3 human warlock. In case you didn't know, FYI. This is the first Warlock. 26 years of this game about Magic, and this is the first Warlock we've ever seen. Rats you control have menace. That's awesome. It's got 1 and a black and tap it. Create a 1/1 black rat creature token. Or you can pay 2 and 2 black and tap it, and sacrifice 3 rats to gain control of target creature, which is really nice. It kind of sucks that Rat Colony rotates. I never thought I'd catch myself saying that, but this would be really broke with Rat Colony, or perhaps woke with Rat Colony, but I'm leaning more towards broke, to be honest. Black really needs good 2-drops really, really badly. Not even to replace good 2-drops that it's losing. It just needs good 2-drops in the first place, to be honest with you. So if Piper is something we need to be experimenting with before we just, write it off, then we should do that, I guess. We just don't have a lot of great options aside from, like, what is it going to be, this or Eternal Taskmaster? Neither card looks really good, but I at least want to try this because it could run away with the game if it's just kind of left unchecked. So in terms of 2-drops, I think there's a lot of value on this, and I do want to try the card out. But anyway, let's move on to another 2-drop that looks really nice, and that's Tome of Legends. It's an artifact, and it enters the battlefield with a page counter on it. Whenever your commander enters the battlefield or attacks, you put a page counter on Tome. You can pay 1 and tap it and remove a page counter from it to draw a card. So this is just like kind of a card. I don't want to say you have to play it in your commander deck, but I think a lot of players will feel obligated to play this in their commander deck. First of all, it enters the battlefield with a counter on it, so you're able to draw a card no matter what. Even if you never actually get to play your commander that entire game, you get to draw a card. So that's kind of nice in and of itself. But there's also the fact that you're going to be playing your commander, especially decks that play, 1, 2, and 3 cost commanders where they play their commander 4 or 5 times a game, and decks where their whole steez is to play their commander, 6 times in a game by, sacrifice and doing tricks like that. So decks like that will love Tome of Legends, but to be honest, I wouldn't be surprised if this just showed up in nearly every commander deck. Go ahead and get your copy of this. It's going to be a popular card, but as far as standard goes, you don't play it in Standard, but there's moving on. There's Shambling Suit, 3 mana for a 0/3 construct, and its power is equal to the number of artifacts and/or enchantments that you control. So I'm not quite sure why there's not a star here, but still, it is really, really cool. This could see a little bit of Commander play too, because there's obviously a ton of Commander decks that just play a field full of artifacts and enchantments, and obviously Enchantress decks do that as well. But there's tons of Commander decks that take advantage of just this huge battlefield with artifacts all over it too. So I could see this seeing a ton of play, even in like historic and side decks. I could see this seeing play. So this seems to be decent in like pinpoint environments, but I'm not sure how much actual Standard play it sees at the end of the day. Let's move on to All That Glitters. This is 1 and a white for an aura. Enchant creature. Enchanted creature gets +1/+1 for each artifact and or enchantment that you control. So this is kind of like putting the Shambling Suit on one of your creatures, but it also rewards them with a toughness bonus, which is really, really nice. I like this a lot. Again, for Enchantress decks, or maybe even Bogle's decks and such, this looks incredible. So if we've got one of these like build your own battleship type decks in Standard, or a Bogle's deck, you know, just anything that's looking to play a bunch of enchantments on a hexproof creature or something, I can definitely see All the Glitters being an important card. But Shining Armor is a 2 mana sort of enchantment. It's an equipment, but it's a comparable card that I don't like quite as much. I do like the name. That's about it, though. It does have Flash, which helps out the function of the card an awful lot. When it enters the battlefield, you attach it to a knight you control. Equipped creature gets +0/+2 and has Vigilance, and you can equip it for 3 if you're not equipping it to a knight. Now, in the Knights deck, again, we're back to that. I think this is the last Knights Matters card of the day, but I'm just kind of going in chronological order as much as I can. In the Knights deck, this is just okay, and it's probably really good in the Brawl deck, but doesn't quite make the Standard deck unless you're playing against red removal, in which case it probably has a shot at making the sideboard, but I'm still not convinced there aren't better things. But let's move on to Corrider Monitor. This is 2 mana, 1 and a blue for a 1/4 construct, and when it ETBs, you untap an artifact or creature that you control. Not a huge fan of this, but I do like 2 mana 1/4s. If nothing else, especially in Limited, a 2 mana 1/4 is actually a really, really good deal. Hold down the ground for you, extend the game. I love a lot about this. And it can even untap a creature to put it back on defense after it attacked or something. That's really cool. Get you another activation out of an artifact, which could have combo implications here and there, but all things considered, I think this is just like a fun little fair card that if you're trying to get later on into the game in Limited, this might be a nice choice, because 4 toughness for 2 mana is actually a really good deal, and it's kind of one of the best parts of the entire card. Let's move on to Animating Faerie. This is a 3 mana, it's 2 and a blue, 2/2 fairy with flying, but it's got an adventure on it. Bring to Life. 3 mana, 2 and a blue for a sorcery. Target non-creature artifact you control becomes a 0/0 artifact creature. Put 4 +1/+1 counters on it. So for 3 mana, you get a 4/4 artifact creature, which actually isn't a bad deal, especially considering, again, you don't lose the creature half. You get your 4/4 artifact, and then even if they kill your artifact, you still get a 2/2 flyer next turn or the turn after that or whenever you need it. So I really like this in Limited, especially in a format full of food tokens that you're going to be trying to do something with other than just like sacrifice them to gain life, which is sometimes going to be really nice. But when it's not, and you need other uses for these food tokens, this can be a really good way to spend it. So I like this an awful lot. Again, in Limited, I don't think it has too many, applications outside of Limited. But in Limited, this looks like a pretty feature uncommon. But speaking of premier blue uncommons in Limited, here's Frogify right here. Frogify? I think it's Frogify. Just 1 and a blue for an enchantment. Enchant creature. Enchanted creature loses all abilities and is a blue frog creature with base power and toughness 1/1. So you just make any of their creatures into a 1/1 that can't do nothing, kids. So it's effectively removal. That said, we've already got like Kesmina's Transmutation, hasn't seen any Standard play, so I can feel fairly confident saying this won't either. But this is great in Limited if you're in blue-green, for instance, or another color combination that doesn't have access to a ton of good removal. This can effectively be just as good as removal in the Limited environment, so I like this card there. Oh, by the way, there's also Command Tower. We made it to Command Tower. It's just like in this set, so that's good. Don't have a Command Tower yet. Probably going to be able to get a hold of it. That's good. That's nice. But let's move on to one of the new commanders we saw today, Sir Gwyn, Hero of Ashvale. This is 6 mana, 3, a red, a white, and a black. Mardu colors. for a 5/5 human knight with vigilance and menace. And whenever an equipped creature you control attacks, you draw a card and you lose a life. And equipment you control have equipped knight, 0. So you can just go willy-nilly equipping equipments to knights all you want, switching them out, doing whatever. It doesn't matter. It's going to cost you nothing. And I really like that. I don't like the prospect of killing myself when I go to attack in. That's not great, but you do get a bunch of drawn cards off of this, and again, the Knight deck needs a little bit of reach, and card advantage is part of reach in the late game, so like that an awful lot, but you have to have the equipment to make it actually work, and I'm not sure that you always will. How many equipments do you actually have out at one time in the Knight deck? It's probably not enough to really make this card pop off the way it wanted to, draw 3 cards per attack step. I'm not sure it's going to do that for you, but the stats are at least solid enough to be a decent commander for the Knight deck, and I'm not sure that it really ends up seeing any standard play whatsoever, but I'm not sure that these Brawl commanders are supposed to, except for maybe one of them. Moving on with Brawl commanders, we saw the other 3 entirely today. We'd already seen Chulane, but we saw the Mardu one and the Jund one as well. And another one we'll get to in a minute, but the Jund one is Korvold, Fey Cursed King. This card is fun looking to me, and I'm excited to play with it. 5 mana for a 4/4 Dragon Noble with flying, so creature types are on point. And whenever it enters the battlefield or attacks, you have to sacrifice another permanent. But whenever you sacrifice a permanent, you put a +1/+1 counter on Korvold, and you draw a card. So it's basically a 5/5 that flies for 5 mana. Already okay stats, and you get to draw the card when it ETBs, and there's obviously a ton of ways you can turn sacrificing a permanent into an enormous upside, not just with Afterlife, but with a ton of other stuff in this format. We got Midnight Reaper to draw even more cards when something dies, Cruel Celebrant and stuff. Judith can pop off. There's a million ways to make this card way better than it looks on its surface, and I really cannot wait to get in the lab with Korvold. It looks pretty nice, although, again, I'm not sure that this is exactly where you want to be in standard play. Compared to something like Bantu, for instance, I'm not quite sure it's where you want to be. But the best looking standard commander that we saw today, at least, to me, is Leela, Artful Provocateur. This is 1 and then Esper colors, a white, a blue, and a black, for a 2/3 Fairy Warlock with Flying, Death Touch, and Lifelink. So a 2/3 Flying, Death Touch, Lifelink, Vampire Nighthawk stats. But for a mana extra, what do you get for that extra mana investment? Other creatures you control with flying get +1/+0. That's pretty good. And whenever you cast an artifact or enchantment spell, you create a 1/1, really a 2/1 when you think about it, blue 1 or a blue fairy creature token with flying. And that's insane. It's so insanely good, especially for the Brawl or Commander format. This is just a pitch-perfect commander, but I think that of all the commanders that we saw spoiled today, this is the best looking for standard play. Now, it does only have the 3 toughness at 4 mana, which is the sort of the thing I'm reserved most about when it comes to this card. I'm not really sure how I like how the stats go with the mana cost, but if you can keep it out whatsoever, it's going to create all the value for you in the world. It's kind of like a Murmuring Mystic in a way, except it works with artifacts and enchantments. And I can definitely see a world where you cast, 2 or 3 artifact enchantments or enchantments in the upcoming turns and get all these 2/1s. You're just creating all the value in the world. You're forcing a board wipe. Even if your opponent removes your Leela, you still have all this value that she left behind. And if she does get to stay out, Death Touch and Flying and Lifelink are just obviously an amazing combination of abilities. We know that, just historically. That's a crazy combination of abilities. Brickwall's aggro decks, and it's just really tough to get out from under if you don't have the removal spell for it. So I really like a lot about this card, and I think it can easily take over a board if left unchecked. And since it's in blue, all you have to do is hold up counter magic to make sure you're able to counter the removal spell or whatever. And then you can just go to town. So I really like this card an awful lot, and I hope that it goes a long way, but I'm just as reserved about it as I am these other commanders. I just think it's the best looking out of all 3 that we saw this afternoon. But moving on, let's look at Savvy Hunter. This is a card that I think looks much better to me than it has to the majority of the community. This is 3 mana, 1 a green and a black for a 3/3 human warrior. And when it attacks or blocks, you create a food token. Now you sacrifice 2 foods and you draw a card. That's actually quite good. It's reminiscent of Tireless Tracker to me. Even though it doesn't get bigger as the game goes on the way Tracker did, it's still a way to convert these random artifact tokens that you're pooping out in this set, like we could with Clues and Tireless Tracker, into card advantage. And you know, you're not always going to get a food token off of this card, but you very often will, because it's going to either attack or block. One or the other. Either that, it's going to eat a removal spell in the face immediately, but if it doesn't, it will do one of these two things and start creating food tokens. But if you have Gilded Goose or Oko or any of the other cards that create food tokens, then suddenly this is drawing you a card or two extra a game, and the stats for the mana cost, that ratio, isn't exactly poor to begin with. 3 mana for a 3/3 is fine, and if it even draws you one card, then I think it's done its job. But even if this never draws you a card and it creates a food token that gains you more life, that's pretty good too. You know, the ability to either draw cards or gain some life for you, keeping the game depending on the situation, is going to be nice, and it comes on a pretty stout body at a relatively low cost. So I love a lot about this card, and I think that there's a few people misjudging it on first glance, because it doesn't really look like much when you first read it, but you get to thinking about it, you compare it to Tireless Tracker, I think that there's a lot this card can do in the upcoming format. And there are a few reasons why green-black looks like a particularly good color combination. We'll get to one of those at the end of this video, but let's move on to Rosethorn Acolyte real quick. This is 2 and a green for a 2/3 Elf Druid. You can tap it to add a mana of any color, but the adventure here is Seasonal Ritual. It's a green mana for a sorcery that just adds a mana of any color to your mana pool. So that's actually kind of neat. It's not Metamorphose or whatever, but it's at least a storm count. It's 1 on the storm count for effectively a free spell, and that might actually matter. It also fixes your mana without having to play like weird lands or something, but I'm not really sure how great the card is. All in all, I will say though, if you need to fix your mana in the early game, this is a way of doing it, and then you get a creature later on that, you know, also fixes your mana for the rest of the game and actually has a decent toughness. So I think this is a fine card. I love that it's common. I don't know that it's going anywhere in standard, but I think that it has, you know, a ghost of a chance, just a whisper of a chance, but I highly doubt it at the end of the day. If anything, it'll go in a deck that can somehow take advantage of the fact that you just get a free spell for your storm count or something off of this. But let's move on to Steel Claw Lance. This is 2 mana, a black and a red for an equipment. Equipped creature gets +2/+2. Now, you can equip it to any regular old creature for 3 mana, but you can equip it to a knight for 1 mana. Now, obviously, we've seen their commander, so we know that the knight deck needs equipment. This is definitely one that you want to play, and although I'm not sure that it ends up seeing standard play, it might. 2 mana, and equipping for just 1 mana for this bonus isn't actually too bad. Now, we've already seen things like, what is it, Knight's Pledge, I want to say. It's like 2 mana, or enchanted creature gets +2/+2. That sees almost no standard play, and this is technically worse than that, especially in terms of mana cost. So I'm not really sure this is going to see any play whatsoever, but in the Knight's deck specifically, if it's trying to be a thing, I could see it maybe fitting a copy or two of this, because it's like a Rancor in a way. The creature might die, but it never actually goes away, and that might be just worth it enough to make it, you know, get a slot in those decks. Let's move on to Knight's Charge. I was wrong, by the way. It wasn't the last Knight's Matter card of the day. We saw a bunch of these. Let's look at this one. It's 3 mana, 1, a black, and a white for an enchantment. Whenever a knight you control attacks, each opponent loses 1 life, and you gain 1 life. That's really, really good. And you can pay this huge amount of mana and sacrifice Knight's Charge to return all knight creature cards from your graveyard to the battlefield. That costs like 8. But obviously, if you have 8 mana and the game's gone on long enough, this is a great way, again, of getting that late game reach. Now, the deck needs, again, even more of this than it currently has, but this is a great way of doing it. You can do this at instant speed, keep that in mind. Now, the first bit of text on it is actually the one that I'm more interested in. I think 3 mana is a little bit steep for this enchantment, but basically getting a Sanctum Seeker that can't attack itself, but is also not susceptible to creature removal, might be a big gain for these Knight decks. So I really like this card a lot. Even though I'm a little bit wary of it, I like all of the text on it. Let's move into Banish into Fable. 6 mana, 4, a white, and a blue for an instant. When you cast this spell from your hand, copy it if you control an artifact, then copy it if you control an enchantment. You may choose new targets for these copies. Return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. You create a 2/2 white knight creature token with vigilance. So if you're able to fully proc this and get both copies and end up returning 3 non-land permanents to their hand and getting 3 2/2 knights with vigilance, The card is insane at instant speed, by the way, ladies and gentlemen. That is a really, really good deal to be able to do this during your opponent's end step or during your opponent's combat step. This could be a huge, swingy thing, so I actually think this card has an outside chance of seeing some amount of play, but you have to enable it. Obviously, you have to play artifacts and enchantments to actually make it worth it. So you have to put this in a very particular standard deck, but I think we might have some of the tools that make it worth trying to make this card work. Because if you actually get, all 3 copies of it at one time, it's just a ridiculous card to cast. But that's not all that deals with artifacts and enchantments today. We actually got to see a lot of cards through the Brawl deck that work with artifacts and enchantments. Here's Shine Chaser right here. It's 1, a blue, and a white for a 1/1 fairy with flying and vigilance. And it gets +1/+1 as long as you control an artifact, and +1/+1 as long as you control an enchantment. So all in all, you get a 3 mana, 3/3 flying vigilance if you control the requisite permanent types. And that's probably not good enough, to be honest. Resplendent Angel, for instance, didn't see a ton of play in the last format. Kalia doesn't see all the play in the world. And these are 3 mana, 3/3 flying creatures that you don't have to work for at all and have other abilities and they don't even see play. So I'm not sure that this is quite good. So let's move on to Arcanist Owl right here. This is another hybrid mana card. Costs 4 of the Azorius colors, however you want to parse it out. And it's a 3/3 artifact bird with flying. When it ETBs, you look at the top 4 cards of your library. You may reveal an artifact or enchantment card from among them, put it into your hand, put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So it's like a Glint Nest Crane. But it can also pick up enchantments, and it's got a pretty decent body on it, and you can play it in either blue or white. You're not restricted to just blue like you were with Glint Nest Crane. That said, you have to pay a lot more for your Glint Nest Crane these days, but I still think it's well worth it, both in Commander and Brawl, where it obviously belongs. You want cards like these, but even in Standard, again, in very particular decks that want to play a bunch of artifacts or enchantments. That's my favorite thing about this card, is that it doesn't restrict you to, I'm just going to play decks with artifacts, like Glint Nest Crane. I'm only going to play blue, like Glint Nest Crane. Now, instead, you can play all white if you want to. You can play all enchantments, no artifacts, and this card is still worthy of inclusion. And I really, really like the sort of flexibility on this card. You don't have, you don't have to do all or nothing. You can do a little bit of both. You can do one or the other. It doesn't matter. And I really like the again, the versatility on the design of this card. But in very specific Standard decks, I can see this being worth all 4 of that mana. But let's move on to Thorn Mammoth here. 7 mana, 5 and 2 green for a 6/6 elephant with trample. And whenever Thorn Mammoth or another creature enters the battlefield under your control, Mammoth fights up to 1 target creature you don't control. That is maybe worth 7 mana, especially in a format where we can generate 7 mana so easily right now. We've got Nissa, a bunch of mana dorks, and a bunch of other ways to create mana right now in Standard and beyond. We've already seen a few ways in Throne of Eldraine to create big mana as well. So Thorn Mammoth doesn't actually look too difficult to get to, and it might be the best way to spend 7 mana in your green deck once you're able to actually get to 7 mana. It's just, it immediately fights something when it enters the battlefield, and every time you cast a creature after that, it fights something. So it's kind of like Gargos, the legendary Hydra that we just saw, but it's not legendary. You have multiple copies of it out at the same time. Hey, Waverly. And, it's not restricted to just like Hydras or when something gets targeted or whatever. It's not quite that. It's just whenever you play a creature, you kill something, and that's insane, especially for green decks and Simic decks. But let's move on to, God, is this my favorite card of the day? Could it possibly be? Let's look at Witch's Oven, everybody. Witch's Oven is just 1 mana for an artifact. You can tap it and sacrifice a creature to create a food token. If the sacrificed creature's toughness was 4 or greater, you create 2 food tokens instead. Now, obviously, flavor very much on point. Hansel and Gretel, we all get the thing, and that's great, but I love this card. It only cost 1 mana. Super, super low mana investment to get this down. Played as early as turn 1, and it sacrifices creatures. You only get to do it once a turn unless you have a way of untapping it, like the 2 mana 1/4 that we saw earlier. Keep that in mind. But if you do have ways of untapping it, it gets really, really nice. But even just once a turn, you get a free sacrifice trigger for stuff like Judith or Spawn. What is it? The Devils. that cost 3 mana. Whenever you sacrifice a thing, they ping for 1. Stuff like that. You know, Footlight Fiend, you're able to get the dice trigger off of. Cruel Celebrant, you'll get the dice trigger off of that when you sacrifice creatures. So there's just so many things I like about Witch's Oven right now. And even though I'm not sure that it fits into these Aristocrats decks, I'm not sure it's worth the slot. We do need as many free sacrifice outlets for decks like that, and Teysa, for instance, as we can possibly get. And this is another way to add one of those effects in Standard. So I'm really, really hyped for this. Anyway, let's look at Taste of Death. This is 6 mana, 4 and 2 black for a sorcery, so it better be awesome. It turns out it is. Each player sacrifices 3 creatures, and then you create 3 food tokens. So this looks awesome in Control, although it is a sorcery. I don't like the speed on this card whatsoever, and it's probably going to keep it out of these Control decks. But just imagine in a Control deck making them sacrifice 3 creatures like a mini Wrath, and creating enough, life to keep you in the game. 9 life, which can be done at instant speed. Or at least the cracking of the food tokens can be done at instant speed. So I actually really think this card is very nice, and it's probably at least limited playable, if nothing else, because it's removal, But I think that there's probably an odd Standard deck here or there that might want to play this card. And keep in mind that even though it is sorcery speed, we do have 3 mana Teferi in this format that lets you just cast things at instant speed, so it might actually be somewhat playable. But speaking of Control, let's look at Shimmer Dragon real quick. Sorry about the resolution on some of these cards. It's the best we have available on the internet right now. I should have said that way earlier, but anyway. Shimmer Dragon is 6 mana, 4 and 2 blue for a 5/6 dragon with flying. And as long as you control 4 or more artifacts, Shimmer Dragon has hexproof. You can also tap 2 untapped artifacts you control to draw a card. So a Control finisher, probably not so much because of the huge commitment towards artifacts that you have to have, but if you are playing artifacts, the card is absolutely insane because it's just free cards drawn every single turn. Imagine the card advantage this can get for you. And if you do have 4 artifacts out, the hexproof is just, that's unbelievable on this card. Like, this makes it a really difficult card to beat for all kinds of reasons. You have to make them sacrifice Shimmer Dragon if you're actually going to deal with it, or maybe board wipe or something like that. So I'm loving the hexproof on this, even though 4 artifacts is an awful lot. But even if you don't have 4 artifacts and they're able to target this with a removal spell, then when it's on its way out, you can still tap 2 artifacts and draw a card, so it's like it replaces itself. I actually think this card is very powerful. But here's a blue card that costs even more. This is Workshop Elders. It's 7 mana, 6 and a blue for a 4/4 Human Artificer. Artifact creatures you control have flying. At the beginning of combat on your turn, you may have target non-creature artifact you control become a 0/0 artifact creature. If you do, put 4+1/+1 counters on it. Notice it doesn't say until end of turn. So every single, combat step on your turn, you get a 4/4. As long as you have artifacts, you get a 4/4. And that is really nice. Again, 7 mana is possible in this format, but I'm just really not sure what deck ends up. Sorry, I just bumped the mic. I'm not really sure what deck ends up playing this in Standard. And 7 mana, even though we can make it in Standard, there's probably better options at this mana cost. So I'm just not totally sure it ends up seeing much play, but in the Brawl decks it's meant for, it's a very good card. So let's move on to Keeper of Fables here. 5 mana, 3 and 2 green for a 4/5 cat. Creature type's awesome. And whenever 1 or more non-human creatures you control deal combat damage to a player, you draw a card. Now, that's just okay, especially for an uncommon. This is great and limited, but it's only ever going to draw you 1 card. Note how it's worded. So, whenever just it attacks, keep that in mind. Whenever it attacks and deals combat damage to a player, drawing a card is nice enough. But if you're able to attack with 4 creatures and only 1 of them gets through for combat damage, you still draw a card, which is really, really nice. Now, do note again, if 2 of them get through for combat damage, you're still only drawing 1 card. Unless you have multiples of this out, in which case it's really good. But again, this is only limited playable. I'm not seeing this see any play above that level. As far as other stuff, though, we're about to close out the day, y'all. We have 9 more cards to go. Actually 8 more cards, because one of these got leaked and I don't want to talk about it just yet. But anyway, here's Silverwing Squadron. This costs 6 mana, yet another card that costs 1 million. 5 and a white for Star Human Knight with flying and vigilance. Its power and toughness are each equal to the number of creatures you control, and whenever it attacks, you create a number of 2/2 white knight creature tokens with vigilance equal to the number of opponents that you have. So even if you're just playing a one-on-one game of Magic, then this is going to create a 2/2 every single turn, which actually ain't too bad, kid. But if you're playing a standard game of Commander where you have at least 3 other opponents, this actually gets really, really good really, really quick. So it definitely scales to the format that you're playing it in. In Commander, it's probably well worth the slot, but in Standard, 6 mana is just too much for this. Let's look at Embereth Skyblazer right here. This is 4 mana, 3 and a red for a 4/3 human knight. And as long as it's your turn, it has flying. And whenever it attacks, you may pay 2 and a red. If you do, creatures you control get plus X plus 0 until end of turn, where X is the number of opponents that you have. So another one of these. We saw kind of a whole cycle of these today. And again, this kind of scales to what format you're playing it in, Commander or Brawl. It looks much, much better, especially if you are brawling with more than just one opponent. This looks really, really nice, but this is one of those where, unlike Silverwing Squadron, I'm not quite sure that it's worth the investment in those one-on-one games. But here's my favorite of this little cycle right here. This is Chittering Witch, which has awesome art. It's 4 mana, 3 and a black for a 2/2 human warlock. We get our second warlock on the day. And when it enters the battlefield, you create a number of 1/1 black rat creature tokens, each equal to the number of opponents that you have. And you can pay 1 and a black and sack a creature to have target creature get -2/-2 until end of turn. So let's say you're just playing Standard, right? This comes into play, you get a 1/1 rat. So for 4 mana, you get 3/3 worth of stats on 2 bodies. And you can have the option to sacrifice the 1/1 body for 2 mana to kill a creature. That's actually not that bad. That's really not that bad. So definitely in games where you have 3 to 7 opponents, this is really, really nice. In an 8-player game of Commander, this is an unbelievable card. So play it in those decks. And note how well it goes with the Pied Piper from earlier, by the way, in those 7-player Commander decks. If you're able to actually play both cards in the same game, you're going to have enough rats to steal a thing or two. So keep that in mind. But I honestly think that this might scale the best to just normal Standard play of any of the cards that we've seen in this sort of cycle of things that want you to have a bunch of opponents. But there is another. Here's Gluttonous Troll. 4 mana, 2, a black, and a green for a 3/3 troll with trample. And when it ETBs, you create a number of food tokens equal to the number of opponents that you have. You can also pay 1 and a green and sacrifice another non-land permanent, including, conveniently, a food token, to have troll get +2/+2 until end of turn. Now, this is kind of nice, because even though it costs mana to activate, it still gives you a way to sacrifice multiple permanents in the same turn, and that can be really nice for certain decks, but it is a relatively large investment. That said, you'll end up with this huge attacker out of the deal with trample, and even though Nantuko Husk is free to activate, it doesn't have trample, and it'd be a much better creature if it did. The threat of activation when Gluttonous Troll swings in is huge, especially considering you don't even have to sacrifice other creatures. That's the problem with things like Nantuko Husk. Again, you swing in, and it has the threat of activation of being able to sacrifice every other swinging creature if it's unblocked and just go huge, This, you can just, all your creatures can swing in. Some of those creatures can block, can get blocked, or still deal combat damage. And you can just sacrifice all your lands or something to end the game with Gluttonous Troll. So I do think that I like this card a lot more than some of the other cards in this cycle if we're looking at specifically Standard play. The stats aren't great for the mana cost, but you get an awful lot of options from this card, and again, the threat of activation is what it's all about here, and it could go in very specific decks. It obviously goes in the Commander deck, the Brawl deck, that wants you to have the Sacrifice Stuff Commander, but at the same time, again, I think this scales well, reasonably well at least, towards Standard. By the way, you can't sacrifice all your lands. You can't sacrifice any other things that aren't lands. And also aren't creatures. You can sacrifice, enchantments and artifacts and whatnot. Other, food tokens if you have a bunch of them or whatever. And just, again, go huge on one big attack. So I really like a lot of what it looks like you can do with Gluttonous Troll. But let's look at the pun of the day. The SBMTG award for pun of the day goes to Belle of the Brawl right here. This is 3 mana, 2 and a black for a 3/2 human knight with menace. And whenever Belle of the Brawl attacks, I'll never get tired of saying that name, other knights you control get +1/+0 till end of turn. I like this because it's not legendary. You get multiple copies of this out. It looks really, really nice. And Knights already has a 2 mana, bear, anthem effect. So this just stacks with that in really nice ways. It also has the legendary enchantment that gives an anthem effect to all your creatures. So if you're actually able to get all the various anthem effects out with Knights, then suddenly you just have a bunch of huge creatures. So I think that this is one of those that adds to the Knight collection in Standard to actually make that deck look playable. And if we are going to make a Standard Knights deck, this is definitely a card I want all 4 copies of. But we're getting close, y'all. Here's Fairy Formation right here. 5 mana, 4 and a blue for a 5/4 Fairy with flying. Not bad stats. and you can pay 3 and a blue to create a 1/1 fairy creature token with flying and draw a card. So this is going to win you every game of Limited that you ever actually get it in, if it's available in Limited. I'm actually not sure this might only be a Brawl deck thing, but that said, it's still standard playable if nothing else. I'm just not sure it's available to play in Limited. But in any case, once it's on the battlefield, this thing is ridiculous. Yeah, it can be lava coiled too. I have some of the same reservations I have about any 5 cost creature with only 4 toughness. But that said, if it does survive a turn or two, or survives long enough for you to untap so that you can respond to removal by making a fairy or even 2, this card looks really, really nice. If you have a surplus of mana and you need a way to spend it, like in the blue-green deck that's looking to play a huge mass manipulation or something, if you don't have your manipulation yet, but you can make 12 mana, then yeah, go ahead and make 3 1/1 flyers. So, hey, Waverly, you really want the tensions right now. I'm willing to give it to you. But anyway, again, once this card is out and you untap with it on the battlefield, I think it's actually really, really dangerous. But I'm just not sure that it's worth the slot in your standard deck to try it in the first place. There's probably better things you could be doing for 5 mana. But let's look at Steelbane Hydra to almost close it out here. This is X and 2 green for 0/0 Turtle Hydra. Peep that creature type. And it enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it. You can pay 2 and a green and remove a +1/+1 counter on it to destroy an artifact or enchantment. So it is a pretty hefty investment to destroy artifacts and enchantments, but it's like a super thrashing Brontodon that doesn't actually have to die to bust up, artifacts and chants. So that's actually really, really nice. I love the cut of this card's jib. I'm not sure that it replaces like Hydroid Krasis. It obviously doesn't, but it might be an interesting sideboard option for a deck here and there. I like it a lot in that role. Also, again, I can't get over the creature type. I love the art on this, so I gotta give it points for that, but I don't think that it really goes anywhere outside of some sideboard slots in some standard decks. Even if that is a thing, those decks might still full well play Thrashing Brontodon, but it's really nice to be able to bust up an artifact or an enchantment and be able to do it again later in the game and still have a reasonably big creature in the meantime. But let's look at the final card of the day. I saved the best for last. Here's Garruk, Cursed Huntsman. He's back. He's finally. How many sets now? Is it 10 sets? Something like that? We've been like, where's Garruk, man? Apparently he's been chilling out in Eldraine this entire time. It's 4, a black and a green, 6 mana for a 5 loyalty planeswalker. You can 0 the Garruk to create 2/2/2 black and green wolf creature tokens with. When this creature dies, put a loyalty counter on each Garruk you control. So if you have more Garruks, somehow you get more loyalty. That's nice. But anyway, -3, destroy target creature, draw a card. That's really good. And you can -6. You get an emblem with creatures you control, get +3/+3, and have trample. Now, I think this is actually really, really good. After really thinking about it for a while, when I first read it, I wasn't too impressed. But actually, I think this is very good at almost any point in the game, whether you're ahead or behind. I think if you're ahead or at parity, the card is very, very just insanely good to pull you ahead. But I think even if you're behind, this is a really good card because you're able to immediately create 2 creatures to help catch you back up and protect your Garruk. 2/2/2s is actually really good for protecting your Planeswalker. It sucks that you can't plus your Garruk in any way other than your wolves dying, but whether you're ahead or behind, your opponent's going to be trying to kill your wolves or attacking into you, so you have to block with your wolves. And if you're able to do that, then suddenly your Garruk gets more loyalty, and you can ultimate it on the next turn if it didn't take any other damage, which is actually going to create all these situations where your opponent doesn't want to attack into the 2 wolves you just created. Because if they do, you'll lose the wolves. Garruk will be able to ultimate, you'll get that emblem on the next turn. But if they don't attack into you, then you just get to create 2 more wolves on the next turn. Like 2/2 guys every single turn is a ton of value. I think this is as close as we're going to get to the 6 mana Elspeth in standard ever again. It doesn't create 3 creatures a turn like Elspeth did, but it does technically create more PT, which is really nice. And it's got an amazing ability on it in terms of removal too. This is another thing that can catch you up when you're behind really easily. Just destroy their biggest thing, draw a card, and if Garruk is able to survive until your next turn, just start creating wolves or whatever. And if they die, suddenly you can -3 them again. It's just, the -3 ability is very good, and I've seen some people say that it's not as good as like Vraska Relic Seeker, a card this is getting compared to a lot today. But I think that drawing a card is just way better than like making a treasure or being able to stretch out to kill artifacts or enchantments and stuff. No, I think drawing a card is just way better in most cases than those other perks that you get with Vraska. So I just love every ability on this Planeswalker. The ultimate's not hard to get to at all. And once you do get to the ultimate, then you're effectively creating 10 power every single turn when you zero the Garruk. So it's just, things snowball super fast. And as far as 6-mana Planeswalkers in Standard, I think this is right either at parity or just slightly better than a card like Liliana or Chandra. This card looks amazing to me, and in a format that looks more dirtily and mid-rangey as the days go on, it's just, I'm 90% sure that we're in a mid-range format as soon as rotation hits. And if we are, then this is the card du jour. This is the one you want to be playing, because this just looks like an insane card in a mid-range format. So, whoo, boys, Garruk, y'all, boy, ladies and gents. Garruk. Each set we see a 6-mana Planeswalker. That's just off the wall, and they seem to get better and better. Garruk is that this time around. I'm glad that Garruk's back, but like, I'm also like kind of blown away by what they did with Garruk. Like, I think that this is a very, very, very overpowered Planeswalker. So if you wanted my take on it, you got it now. But that's it. That's all for the day. I think we actually made pretty good time on this one. I hope I didn't spend an hour and a half talking about this, but anyway, hopefully I'll be able to get this edited up and thrown on the internet for you before too long, because, man, I just did not expect there to be like 80 new cards today. It feels like there were. We've seen 74 cards out of 269. That is a third of the set, give or take, so, geez, in one day, you know? So, whew. Hope that was enough information for you, but just keep in touch with the channel, because there's going to be spoilers most days, and we're going to keep up with those. And I've also got a bunch of other like top 10 videos I want to kick out before the new format starts. So make sure you like and subscribe to the channel for all that content. Check out the Patreon if you want to support my hard work, because I work hard and I'm worth it. And check out TCG Player if you want to pre-order any of this stuff. Link in the description for that. They're the cheapest place you're going to get any of these cards. So keep that in mind. Do all the YouTube stuff for me, and I will catch you cats later. I am Dev from The Place. Thanks for watching, my wizards. Spread love and be kind. I need a drink.